What if you could take a step back and look at the world? Explore the line between certainty and doubt. You are listening to the Illumination Hour with your host, Ellen-Stallone. Hello, and welcome back to another wonderful episode of the Illumination Hour. Today, I have a special subject planned, as always, and I'm really going to be honing into kind of what the intro says, exploring that line between certainty and doubt, and looking at the world through a new perspective, through a unique way of seeing things. And if you've ever studied system theory, you'll probably be familiar with this already. But what I want to talk about today is emergence, and what that is exactly. It's a really fascinating phenomena that happens everywhere on Earth, everywhere in the universe, and it's something that I think we don't really notice as much as we could. And, I think the most beautiful moments in my life are when I stop and start to realize how many things are actually emergent properties, and then, figuring out what the constituent elements of those emergent things are. So I'm going to start kind of general and then work my way into specific when I'm talking about this topic. So first I'm just going to explain to you what emergence is, what it means exactly. So according to Wikipedia, in philosophy, systems theory, science, and art, emergence is a process whereby larger entities arise through interactions among smaller or simpler entities, such that the larger entities exhibit properties the smaller or simpler entities don't exhibit. So breaking that down, it basically means if you're looking at something, whatever it is, say you're looking at a piece of music, for example, it exists as this wonderful, beautiful thing that you can listen to. But if we break it down into its smaller parts, such as like the drum or the guitar or whatever other instruments are in there, those existing on their own are, something simple, something like just a drum beat. But when you start layering on all of the other instruments, all of a sudden, it's not just the drums or the guitar. It suddenly becomes something more. It's brought to life in this way that the individual instruments by themselves just simply couldn't do. Now, one way of saying this is to say that the product is greater than the sum of its parts. There are a few requirements for emergent properties to emerge. First, there's this idea of synchronization, which is basically when things occur at the same time or in the same pattern. And next is the idea of synergy. So that means when things work together with each other or are united by something. When synergistic parts work together, they achieve more than they could by themselves. So things are happening at the same time and they're working together, cohesively. And the main difference between synergy and emergence is that with synergy, things are quantitatively similar, but in emergence, whatever it is, takes on a whole new qualitative aspect to it. In order for that to happen, whatever it is has to go through some sort of phase transition. And when I say that, I mean it starts out as something simple, And then through this synchronicity and synergistic process, it somehow goes through this phase transition, which completely alters its state of being into something entirely new. So it takes on new properties. Most common phase transition is used to describe, say, the transition between liquid and solid, or solid and gas. And for exactly the same reason, as things transition between liquid and gas, or solid and liquid, they take on new properties. They behave in a completely different way, even though the constituent parts are the same. Another way to describe this process is through differentiation, which is a concept that denotes the process through which an entity is distinguished from another within the same field or a given system. For example, differentiation happens with stem cells. As a fetus is growing, they start out as just this glob of cells that are basically all the same. And then as the fetus starts to develop more, these cells, they change into more specific cells that are suited for certain tasks better than others. So some cells might go into your brain, or some cells might go into your liver, or some cells might go into your fingers. So differentiation basically describes the process by which things that are the same take on new properties and move into a different state of existence. They become something new. Conventionally, there are a few ways of describing emergence in a more understandable way, and I have an article here from emergence.co.uk about the classic example of emergence theory, which generally is chess. Emergence theory describes how simple rules interact together and result in the growth and development, but not always in ways that we can predict. Chess is often used as a great example of emergence theory in action. Governed by relatively few simple rules, such as where the chess pieces can move and how they can move, complex and fascinating outcomes can be seen in the game between two skilled players. The outcome of the game is unpredictable, precisely because such simple rules can lead to complex, unpredictable results. However, we're not seeking unpredictable results. We don't want to play games. We're seeking specific positive outcomes. Rules or laws have no causal efficacy. They do not, in fact, generate anything. They serve merely to describe regularities and consistent relationships in nature. These patterns may be very illuminating and important, but the underlying causal agencies must be separately specified, though often they're not. But that aside, the game of chess illustrates precisely why any laws or rules of emergence and evolution are insufficient. Even in a chess game, you cannot use the rules to predict history or the course of any given game. Indeed, you cannot even reliably predict the next move in a chess game. Why? Because the system involves more than the rules of the game. It also includes the players and their unfolding moment-by-moment decisions among a very large number of available options at each choice point. And chess is a really great example of emergence theory because of the sheer number of possibilities that are within each game. For example, after 3 moves, there are over 9 million different possible positions. After 4 moves, there's over 288 billion different possible positions. In fact, the number of distinct 40-move games is far greater than the number of electrons in the observable universe. And actually, this number can be quantified by the Shannon number, which is a conservative lower bound of the game tree complexity of chess. That number is 10 to the 120th power. So 10 with 120 zeros behind it. That's how many moves are possible, conservatively, in a game of chess. Something else that's interesting about this is that even though there are some simple rules in the game of chess, and there are a select number of pieces with very simple rules as to how they can move on the board, there's no possible way that you can predict the outcome of a game, which is another thing that is important to understand about emergence theory, is that even though you can understand the simple underlying rules and pieces in a system, that doesn't mean that you can figure out how they're going to interact or what the outcome is going to be. So let's get more specific into the general topic of emergence, and then we can cover some more specific examples. This next article is from peggyholman.com, titled, "What is Emergence?" And she starts out with this wonderful quote from Carl Sagan, who's an amazing scientist. He says,
"If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe."
For most of us, the notion of emergence is tough to grasp because the concept is just entering our consciousness. When something new arises, we have no simple shorthand language for it. The words we try seem like jargon, so we stumble with words, images, and analogies to communicate this whiff in the air that we can barely smell. We know it exists because something does not fit easily into what we already know. Emergence disrupts. It creates dissonance. We make sense of the disturbances that emergence creates partially through developing language that helps us to tease out useful distinctions. As the vocabulary to describe what is emerging becomes more familiar, our understanding increases. For example, disturbance, disruption, and dissonance are part of the language of engaging emergence. These terms are cousins, and I often use them interchangeably. Disruption is the most general of the three words. If something involves an emotional nuance, chances are that I call the disruption a disturbance. When conflict is involved or the disruption is particularly grating, with a lack of agreement or harmony, I will likely refer to it as dissonance. This paper helps build a vocabulary we can all use by defining emergence. It also provides a brief history of how our understanding of emergence has evolved. It offers some distinctions between strong and weak emergence and describes essential characteristics of emergence, what it looks like and how it behaves. This chapter ends by reflecting on the challenge of learning how to engage emergence. In the preface, I define emergence as simply as possible: order arising out of chaos. A more nuanced definition is higher order complexity arising out of chaos in which novel, coherent structures coalesce through interactions among the diverse entities of a system. Emergence occurs when these interactions disrupt, causing the system to differentiate and ultimately coalesce into something novel. Key elements of this definition are chaos and novelty. Chaos is random interactions among different entities in a given context. Think of people at a cocktail party. Chaos contains no clear patterns or rules of interaction. Make that a cocktail party in which no single culture prevails, so that no one is sure how close to stand to others, whether to make eye contact, or whether to use first or last names. Emergent order arises when a novel, more complex system forms. It often happens in an unexpected, almost magical leap. The cocktail party is actually a surprise party, and everyone knows where to hide and when to sing happy birthday. Emergence produces novel systems, coherent interactions among entities following basic principles. In the bestseller Emergence, science writer Stephen Johnson puts it this way: Agents residing on one scale start producing behavior that lies one scale above them. Ants create new colonies. Urbanites create neighborhoods. Simple pattern recognition software learns how to recommend new books. Emergence in human systems has produced new technologies, towns, democracy, and some would say consciousness, the capacity for self-reflection. If we want to engage emergence, understanding its origins helps. Scientist Peter Corning offers a brilliant essay on emergence. He brought a multitude of sources together to describe an evolution in perspectives. Here are some paraphrased highlights. Emergence has gone in and out of favor since 1875. According to philosopher David Blitz, the term was coined by the pioneer psychologist G.H. Lewes, who wrote, "There's a cooperation of things of unlike kinds. The emergent is unlike its components, and it cannot be reduced to the sum or their difference." By the 1920s, the idea of emergence fell into disfavor under the onslaught of analysis. Analysis was seen as the best means to make sense of our world. In recent years, however, nonlinear mathematical tools have provided the means to model complex, dynamic interactions. This modeling capability has revived interest in emergence, how whole systems evolve. Emergence is intimately tied to studies of evolution. Herbert Spencer, an English philosopher and contemporary of Darwin, describes emergence as an inherent energy-driven trend in evolution towards new levels of organization. It describes the sudden changes in evolution, the move from ocean to land, or from ape to human. Although evolutionary scientists may have done much of the work, people from a variety of disciplines have also struggled to explain this common and mysterious experience. What enables an unexpected leap of understanding in a field of study or practice? In 1962, Thomas Kuhn contributed to our understanding by coining the term paradigm shift to describe a tradition-shattering change in the guiding assumptions of a scientific discipline. Then the Santa Fe Institute, a leader in defining the frontiers of complex systems research, took the work even further. Engagingly told by Mitchell Waldrop in his book Complexity, the story of how the Santa Fe Institute was born reads like a great adventure. In the mid-1980s, a hunch brought biologists, cosmologists, physicists, economists, and others to the Los Alamos National Laboratory to explore odd notions about complexity, adaptation, upheavals at the edge of chaos. Though their disciplines used different terms, they shared a common experience with this strange form of change. They were no longer alone with their questions. Others were exploring the same edges. They gave this experience a name, emergent complexity, or emergence for short. While emergence has aspects of the familiar, mom's nose or dad's eyes, it is its own notion. It isn't just integrating old ideas with what's new. It's something more and different. It is whole systems evolving over time. Single-cell organisms interact, and multicellular creatures emerge. Humans become self-conscious and track their own evolution. In Emergence, Stephen Johnson speaks of how our understanding of emergence has evolved. In the initial phase, seekers grappled with the ideas of self-organization without language to describe it. Without a coherent frame of reference, the ideas were like a magician's illusions. Our attention was diverted to the familiar, while the real action was happening unseen in front of our noses. As language emerged, complexity, self-organization, complex adaptive systems, a second phase began. These terms focused our attention in new directions. People started coming together across disciplines to understand the nature of these patterns. The Santa Fe Institute was central to this phase. During the 90s, we entered a third phase, applied emergence, in which we stopped analyzing emergence and started creating it. In other words, we could see emergence occurring naturally in phenomena like anthills, and we started working with it. For example, developing software that recognizes music or helps us find mates. This book was about creating conditions for applied emergence in our social systems. It aims to help us work with the dynamics of emergent complexity so that our interactions are realized as life-serving outcomes. Scientists also distinguish two forms of emergence: weak and strong emergence. Understanding this distinction clears up some confusion. Predictable patterns of emergent phenomena, such as traffic flows and anthills, are examples of weak emergence. In contrast, strong emergence is experienced as upheaval. When disruptions dramatically change a system's form, as in revolutions and renaissances, strong emergence has occurred. Weak emergence describes new properties arising in a system. A baby is wholly unique from its parents, yet is basically predictable in form. In weak emergence, rules or principles act as the authority, providing context for the system to function. In effect, they eliminate the need for someone in charge. Road systems are a simple example. Strong emergence occurs when a novel form arises that was completely unpredictable. We could not have guessed its properties by understanding what came before, nor can we trace its roots from its components or their interactions. We see stories on television, yet we could not have predicted this form of storytelling from books. As strong emergence occurs, the rules or assumptions that shape a system cease to be reliable. The system becomes chaotic. In our social systems, perhaps the situation is too complex for traditional hierarchy to address it. Self-organizing responses to emergencies are an example. Such circumstances give emergence its reputation for unnerving leaps of faith. Yet, emergent systems increase order even in the absence of command and central control. Useful things happen with no one in charge. Open systems extract information and order out of their environment. They bring coherence to increasingly complex forms. In emergent change processes, setting clear intentions, creating hospitable conditions, and inviting diverse people to connect does the work. Think of it as an extended cocktail party with a purpose. Although the conversation continues, scientists generally agree on these qualities of emergence. Radical novelty. At each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear. For example, from autocracy, which is ruled by one person with unlimited power, to anarchy, where people are the ultimate source of individual power. Coherence, a stable system of interactions, such as an elephant inside of a biosphere. Wholeness, not just the sum of its parts, but also different and irreducible from its parts. For example, humans are more than the composition of lots of cells. Dynamic, always in process, continuing to evolve, such as changes in transportation, from walking to horse and buggy, to automobiles, trains, buses, and airplanes. Downward causation, the system shaping the behavior of the parts. For example, roads determine where we drive. The phrase, "the whole is greater than the sum of its parts," captures key aspects of these ideas. Birds flock, sands form dunes, and individuals create societies. Each of these phrases names a related but distinct system. Each system is composed of, influenced by, but different from its mate. Birds and flocks, sands and dunes, individuals and societies. As with all change, emergence occurs when disruptions shape the interaction. In emergence, coherence breaks apart. Differences surface and reform in a novel system. The two most frequently cited dynamics are that no one is in charge and simple rules engender complex behavior. So the ideas captured here are that no conductor is orchestrating orderly activity, such as in ecosystems, in economic systems, or the activity in a city. Also, randomness becomes coherent as individuals, each following a few basic principles or assumptions, interact with their neighbors. So birds flock and traffic flows. 12-step programs characterize these ideas at work. Most participants are fiercely independent people who are not there to follow someone in authority. Yet, with the guidance offered through 12 statements, these programs are highly complex, worldwide organizations that have influenced the lives of millions. No doubt the simplicity of these two dynamics may leave many senior executives and government agency heads skeptical. No one's in charge? Not likely. Isn't it interesting that the word order is a term for issuing instructions? What happens when orders come from the top? If they disrupt existing functions of the organization, sometimes it moves in novel and useful directions. And sometimes the orders produce entirely unexpected, emergent outcomes that arise from within the system, bearing little resemblance to the orders given. If managers say, "We're too complex for simple rules," chances are they're confusing complicated and complex. We often make things more complicated than necessary. Filling out a form in a bureaucracy is a common example, such as people who have to stand in line at the DMV for hours just to get their driver's license. Complexity is entirely different. Complexity has elegance. It is, to paraphrase Einstein, as simple as possible, but not simpler. Emergence is an energy-efficient approach to accomplishing complex tasks. Consider the different costs of handling conflict through dialogue versus war. Negotiations among a handful of diplomats can lead to breakthrough agreements for all involved. In contrast, armed conflict involves thousands and generally produces results that work for one party, along with loss of life and property for everyone involved. These are quite different propositions in time, money, and in life. There are two key dynamics that shape how novelty arises, how systems, including us, learn and adapt. Increasingly complex and novel forms emerge from interactions among autonomous, diverse agents, like us, through feedback among neighboring agents and clustering as like finds like. Systems grow and self-regulate through feedback. Output from one interaction influences the next interaction. We talk to a neighbor, we share some of the discussion with friends, and suddenly everyone in town knows that Sally married Harry. Disruptions are feedback. They signal potential change. Most of us focus on the symptoms or the visible outcomes of such signals. A fight breaks out, and we concentrate on who's winning and losing. What caused the fight? How else might it be resolved? We ask different questions when we pay attention to what's behind the feedback. Feedback opens communication. It connects what's inside and outside, at the top and bottom, across and within systems. It gives us a chance to notice what is emerging and discern what it means. Systems theory uses feedback loops to help us map how interactions influence each other. It names two types of feedback loops: reinforcing and balancing loops. Perhaps this is how the fight erupted. I speak my mind. It pushes your buttons. You get mad and push back. Even if I hadn't intended to irritate you, now I'm on the defensive. To protect myself, I attack you, and things escalate. In what is called a reinforcing feedback loop, output reinforces an action in the same general direction, sometimes towards more, sometimes towards less. Reinforcing loops are also called vicious, or, when healthy, virtuous cycles. Another form of feedback occurs through balancing feedback loops. Opposite forces counteract each other. Separation of powers among executive, legislative, and judiciary branches of government illustrate balancing loops. I don't think this is a very good example, but this is just the one given in the article. Each keeps the others in check. Perhaps a better example of a balancing loop would be the ecosystem that rabbits live in, for example. Rabbits, as you well may know, reproduce very quickly. But they also rely on the food sources around them, and their population will increase or decrease depending on how much food is available. Also, the higher number of rabbits there are, the more likely that disease will spread. So, the food source and the diseases in the rabbit population serve as checks and balances on how many rabbits there are. So each keeps the others in check. In healthy systems, those that continually learn and adapt, balancing loops periodically interrupt reinforcing loops, ending their perpetual growth. Without such checks, we get global warming, economic meltdowns, and cancer. As we interact, feeding back to each other, like attracts like. Some of us bond around a shared characteristic. For example, we both like the same authors. Over time, small groups with similar interests form. Perhaps parents advocate for a new style of schooling. With continued interaction, small groups become larger groups. Increasingly complex networks take shape when something binds them together. Parents, teachers, and small businesses unite to create new types of schools. At some point, a complex and stable cluster arises. It has unique properties unlike its individual elements. A national movement for charter schools takes off. Something novel emerges. Humans are talented at pattern matching, clustering like with like. We even do it unconsciously. We see it indirectly in how towns and cities are formed. Asian districts exist in San Francisco, New York, and London. All of the auto dealerships are in the same part of town. As maps of the internet are created, clusters of highly interconnected sites are appearing. We are experiencing emergence in process. Through our increasingly sophisticated technology, we can track complex networks forming. New tools show us the neural networks in the brain, the ecosystems of nature, and social structures in cultures. The ability to see complexity is reinvigorating interest in emergence. We can finally study complex patterns over space and time. Such tools make complex stories visible. For example, at a 2010 Journalism That Matters conference, a map of Northwest news and information websites caught the attention of an executive editor. He noticed the competition in the center of the map. He searched long and hard to locate his organization. A colleague explained that their antiquated technology caused the problem. No doubt, priorities changed when the executive returned to the office. The story of Emergence is still young. We have struggled with its existence, described some of its properties, and given it a name. We are early in understanding what it means to social systems, organizations, communities, and sectors such as politics, healthcare, and education. We're just learning how to work with it to support positive changes and deep transformation. In social systems, emergence can move us towards possibilities that serve enduring needs, intentions, and values. Forms can change, conserving essential truths while bringing forth innovations that weren't possible before. In journalism, traditional values of accuracy and transparency are making their way into the blogosphere, social network sites, and other emerging media. Emergence is a process, continual and never-ending. It emphasizes interaction as much as it does the people or elements interacting. Most of us focus on what we can observe: the animal, the project outcome, the object. But emergence involves also paying attention to what is happening. The stranger arriving with different cultural assumptions that ripple through the organization or community. Emergence is a product of interactions among diverse entities. Since interactions don't exist in a vacuum, the context also matters. That is why just bringing diverse people together won't necessarily lead to a promising outcome. Initial conditions set the context. How the invitation is issued, the quality of welcome, the questions posed, the physical space, all influence whether a fight breaks out or warm, unexpected partnerships form. In truth, working with emergence can be a bit like befriending Kokopelli, a trickster of the ancient Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, or his Norse counterpart, Loki. Working with mischievous spirits always has some catches. Which I agree is very true. It can be difficult to work with so many variables in a system, especially when it involves people, because people are a system of systems, and putting those together into a greater ecosystem of systems is kind of risky. I mean, if you're trying to create a group of people, it can be hard to ensure that you all work together towards the same purpose, since everybody has different likes and dislikes and opinions and ways of going about things. You can never really tell how it's going to turn out. And one of the best ways that we can analyze how emergent properties look or how they exhibit themselves is through biology. This is, of course, one of my favorite topics because biology is such a diverse subject. There are millions of different living species on Earth that we can look at, the most simple of which, of course, are bacteria. And there are even different levels of simplicity within bacteria. But let's analyze some things that we can actually look at and, see with our own naked eye. So, what are some of the emergent properties of living things in biology? To help me discuss this topic, I have an article from education.seattlepie.com. At its most basic level, the concept of emergent properties states that with rising levels of complexity in living things, new patterns will emerge. This is the case whether you move up the chain from simple single-celled organisms to much more complex multi-celled organisms, or whether you move from a single organism to an entire population of that organism. So as you know, emergent properties are not limited to biology. The concept of emergence has a place in other branches of science, and in topics as diverse as art and philosophy. Essentially, an emergent property is an entirely new trait that develops from smaller component traits. While the smaller traits may be necessary to make up the larger trait, The larger trait or emergent property is something new and novel in and of itself, and can be broken down into or analyzed solely in terms of its component parts. In the natural world, emergent properties appear at every level of biological organization. When organic chemicals combine to form small cells, for instance, the interactions that give rise to life are difficult, if not impossible, to explain in terms of their component parts. For example, if we're just looking at a single cell, we can see that it has an outer layer, usually a lipid bilayer, which is just a layer formed by fats or phospholipids. This membrane couldn't exist without the properties of the phospholipids that it contains, because there's a polar head and nonpolar tails. And what that means is that the nonpolar tails are repelled by water, but the phosphate head is attracted to water. So when you have two layers, it forms basically a sheath that can surround all of the inner components of the cell. In this example, I'm examining different levels of emergence. For example, on the atomic level, the polar and nonpolar parts of the phospholipid interact with their surroundings in a way that creates this sheath, which is the emergent property. And this outer layer, the sheath of phospholipids, in turn gives rise to a cell, or at least the conditions under which a cell can exist, because it forms a somewhat closed system so that the organelles can exist inside, and they themselves have their own individual purposes. For example, they create proteins, or they can digest molecules and break them down into smaller parts that then go into composing other parts of the cell. But proteins and fats and things like that don't entirely explain what a living cell is. They're just parts of it. When larger groups of animals live together to form a population, the patterns that population takes on and the evolutionary course it follows are not always predictable based on the actions of its members. One of the most widely studied areas of biology is population. Populations of species change according to many facets, including how organisms interact with their environment and with other organisms. The combination of many individuals creates new properties, such as size, density, dispersion patterns, spatial structure. Whether a population is distributed evenly or in clusters over its territorial range, age, structure, sexual distribution, and the genetic variations among members of the population. Emergent population properties are traits that no single individual could exhibit on its own. Probably the best example of this would be Darwin's finches from the Galapagos Islands. So when Darwin went to visit the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that there were many species of finches that were pretty much the same, although each species had a very slight differentiation, as in the size and shape of their beak or their wings. And perhaps there was one finch that all of these species originally came from. But even assuming that, there is no way to know exactly how that finch would reproduce, or how it would distribute itself across the islands, or what it would evolve into. A common emergent property is population interdependence. Humans and ants, for example, are both independent organisms. They function autonomously, each individual controlling its own bodily systems and actions, but both are essentially unable to survive without other members of their own species. Many species require other members of their species to reproduce, and most species evolve not as single individuals but as whole populations, slowly inheriting new traits that benefit the larger group. So there are many examples of these emergent properties in pretty much any animal that you look at, but there are a few specific ones that I want to take a closer look at and go a little bit more into detail into what they are. Because although emergence isn't magic, sometimes it can feel that way. Especially when it comes to looking at life and how it arises from its most fundamental parts. Life seems to be almost this magical spirit that is granted to all of these molecules that glob together in a particular way that form a functioning organism. And I guess that is what has inspired me to be so interested in biology, is that if you take a look at molecules by themselves, they're just made of these little magnetic bundles of matter that interact in very specific ways with each other. But if you take those little magnetic bundles and you clump them together in certain ways that create proteins or fats or carbohydrates, and then you put them all together in this system, they somehow work together in a way that gives rise to self-replicating organisms. They give rise to self-replicating molecules such as DNA, which then enables the reproduction of more of themselves. And then if you put together enough of these molecules, you get this organism, this living thing that can move on its own and make decisions. It can then reproduce and make more of the population. It can have its own thoughts and feelings. It can have its own experiences. So, although living things are made up of inanimate objects, together, in the special way that life is built, they form something greater that can't be explained with the inorganic molecules by themselves. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, ant colonies are a great example of emergent properties because individual ants are not very smart. They will basically wander around aimlessly looking for food if they're just left by themselves. But in the special way that ants interact with each other, as they walk, they leave behind hormone trails, and other ants are attracted to these hormone trails. So if more ants travel down the same hormone path, it creates a stronger and stronger path that more ants will eventually follow down. Ants don't really see the big picture, they just function based on this simple set of rules. Yet out of their simple basic behaviors, such as following the hormone trails or saving the queen at all costs when under attack, the ant colony arises. Individual ants by themselves might not be able to accomplish that much, but the colony together exhibits extraordinary abilities. They explore and they find massive amounts of food. Together they respond to floods by building up walls around the outside of the colony. They can fight against enemies over a substantial piece of ground. Each ant can only survive for a few days or months, but the colony survives for years, becoming more stable and organized over time. Birds are another great example. A bird by itself can just fly in a straight line or in circles, find food, whatever. We all know what birds do. But when birds flock together in flocks that can be hundreds or even thousands of birds, they form beautiful shapes and patterns in the sky, wheeling in perfect synchrony overhead. Even if a single bird fell out of line, there would be confusion and chaos. But when birds fly together, harmony reigns. Flocking has its own sudden course changes and swift motion that's not predictable from knowing all there is to know about any single bird. You could say that flocking emerges from the simple rules that any bird would instinctively follow. And these rules can be staying aligned with their nearest neighbor or keeping a precise distance away from them. Also, birds avoid predators at the same time. But these rules by themselves don't explain how birds can form and shape these abstract, ever-changing sights. Another very important emergent property that I think is just fascinating is that of water. And water molecules themselves are very simple. They're composed of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Hydrogen by itself is an explosive gas, or it is also an acid in most environments. Oxygen is also a highly electronegative atom, which can be poisonous to most materials. For example, oxygen is the reason why iron turns to rust. But when 2 hydrogens join with an atom of oxygen, they turn into a water molecule, which is greater than the sum of its parts. Water molecules together interact in such a way that gives water characteristics such as boiling point, surface tension, and expanding when it freezes, as opposed to pretty much any other material which shrinks when it freezes. The ability of water molecules together to form hydrogen bonds with the neighboring water molecules is what enables complex systems such as life to exist. Cities are another great example of emergent properties. Individual people living on their own, they would probably just spend most of their time finding food and building their shelter and raising their children if they have any, or protecting themselves from harm. But when people start living close to each other, they have this remarkable ability to self-organize. Neighborhoods of similarly minded people will group together, and similar kinds of businesses will also group together. This idea can explain why New York has Chinatown or Little Italy, the garment district or the flower district. These are aspects of culture that arise organically, even against things such as zoning laws or planning commissions, which are examples of top-down forces. But as we mentioned earlier, top-down forces do not always affect systems such as bottom-up systems, like the similarly minded people grouping together. And of course, the most delicious and least commonly referenced emergent property is that of food. Think about it. When you combine different types of food, whether it be spaghetti and tomato sauce, or sugar and flour and chocolate to make cookies, whatever it is, you're putting ingredients together, and the food that you make is, of course, composed of those individual things, but it adds up to something that just tastes amazing and unique in itself. And finally, I want to talk about consciousness, the ultimate emergent property besides life itself. But for some experts, the mind is the ultimate example of emergence. Your brain is composed of billions of neurons that perform very simple functions such as relaying electrical and chemical messages across synapses to their neighbors. It's a physical action, yet out of their collective firings somehow arises a psychological phenomenon, the conscious mind. There's a big debate among experts as to whether or not consciousness can be reduced to the interaction of neurons. But we really have no way of knowing, because the brain is orders of magnitude more complex than any computer today, making that question almost impossible to answer. Although, if we approach this problem as we've approached most other emergent properties, we can say that the brain is made of its component parts, which are brain cells sending synapses to their neighbors. But consciousness is more than that. It's all of those synapses put together and more. And that little bit extra amount of value, the added value, comes from the interactions between each synapse, or between each constituent element in whatever system it is that you're looking at. So, although we might not ever fully understand why emergence exists, or why things add up to more than the sum of their parts, I think this is a fascinating field of study, and I would encourage all of you to try and understand emergence theory a little bit better in any aspect of your life that you're looking at. Because that little bit extra, that added value to whatever it is, that's where the magic in life lies. That's that secret ingredient that everyone is trying to find. I hope you all have enjoyed this episode today. If you'd like to email me with your comments, questions, or anything really, my email is illuminationhour@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. See you next week.